Mem Chesam at base, the second line from the top. Ramli Rav Yirmiyah Rav Zera, he asked the following steer. Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Shalal, Shal Kaisin, Vishal Shel, Shal Maftecha, is if there is a chain that the launderers used, they used to loosely sew together the different garments when they laundered it so that they wouldn't come apart from each other and they wouldn't lose them. So they used to stitch them together, but very loosely and on a temporary basis. Or a chain of keys that were there also to be just on a temporary basis. The keys would be taken off the chain, but the chain was used there just temporarily. V'abeged shutaf b'kilayim, or a beged that was sewn with stitch with kilayim. Now also the stitching with kilayim they're going to be removed. That's not going to be permanent because the beged with kilayim is also a tvilavisha, and you can't get hanof from it. So therefore, it was going to be removed. It's also temporary. So a beged tuma, it's considered one garment for the purposes of tuma, until the point in time when he starts to break them apart to remove one from the other. So as long as they're stitched together or chained together, even if it's on a temporary basis, legabe tuma is considered one garment. Now, clothing, kalim, are only makabel tuma from an avatuma. They're not makabel tuma from a vlad. So therefore, the fact that they're touching each other in the chain, the garments or the touching each other in that chain, there won't be makabel tuma from the touching. If a sheretz, for instance, a dead sheretz, which is an avatuma, if it touches one of the garments, that garment will be tomei midaraisa. That's a rishon l'tuma. Now, just because it's next to another piece of cloth or another garment, it won't be metamet midaraisa. It won't be metamet because a keli can only be makabel tuma from an avatuma. However, if we consider it as one, then just like when a sheretz touches one part of a kli, so if it touches a sleeve of a jacket, the whole jacket becomes tomei. It's not just the sleeve that becomes tomei, it's the whole jacket because it's one item, it's one garment. If a sheretz comes into contact with a knife, it's not just one part of the knife that becomes tomei. It's not just a handle. If it's a permanent handle for that knife, the whole kli becomes tomei. So here we're saying that even though these are stitched together loosely and only on a temporary basis, but so long as they are stitched together, they're considered one. And therefore, when the source of tumah, of the avatuma, touches one, they all become tomei. Until the point in time when he starts to unravel them. When he starts to unravel them, then we don't consider this to be one. They're considered to be separate items, even though some of them are still temporarily attached. But at the point where he starts to now unravel them, we all consider these to be separate items. Now, as we'll see a little bit further in the Gemara, and the way Taisus is mevar this, even though we consider this one legabe tuma, but that's midirabanan. Midirabanan, they are considered as one. Midaraisa, it's not really considered one. And it's not a chibur midaraisa. It's only considered one on a rabbanan, on a level of the rabbanan. So it's a chumrah. It's a chumrah to treat them as one. But it's only a chumrah. And therefore, lamashal, legabe, being matayar them, hazor, where these, when you want to be matayar these begodim, and you would have to, therefore, if you came into contact with mez, you'd need hazah with the water from the ashes of paraduma. Sprinkling on one will not be matar the rest of them. If there's considered one item, if it's considered a chibur midaraisa, so just like coming into contact with one would be matama all of them, similarly, being mazeh, sprinkling on one would be matar all of them. But as we'll see, this is a chumrah derabbanan. Midaraisa, since this is only on a temporary basis that they're stitched together, they're not really considered one. The rabbanan were machmir. People might think that items that were permanently stitched together, permanently attached together, similarly would not be considered as one if we say that this is not considered one. Therefore, they were machmer to say where these are stitched together, even though they're temporary, and even though midaraisa it's not one, we treat it as one, but that's only l'chumra. So if tuma comes into contact with one, they're all tomei. But if you're mazen one, they're not all toher. So Riminu asked the following contradiction: Makil also yad lekurdam, where you're telling me that something which is temporarily attached to the other item is considered a chibur. Well, we have this case over here where there's a stick that's used as a handle for an axe. We're talking about this handle is also made on a temporary basis. You would use a makeshift handle. They take a piece of wood and insert it into the blade of an axe, and after they finished chopping, they would throw the wood and back into the wood pile. So it was also on a temporary basis. Nevertheless, it's chibur l'tuma b'shas melocha. It's only considered a chibur for tuma when it is being used. B'shas melocha only at the time when you're using it. Shaloi b'shas melocha loy, when it's not being used, then it's not considered a chibur. Now here we're saying that even when the launderer is finished laundering this chain of garments, it's still considered a chibur only until the point where he starts untying it. But prior to that, even where it's shaloi b'shas malacha, it is considered a chibur. Now here with this axe, we say it's only b'shas malacha when it's being used, when the handle is being used, but otherwise, it's not considered a chibur. And if tuma comes into contact with the blade, the handle is not tomei. Now, as Rashi points out, the handle itself cannot be makabel tuma. It's pshute klietz, so it wouldn't be makabel tuma. However, if it's considered one, a chibur with the blade, then it's considered part of this kli. We don't look at it independently, then if tuma touches the blade, then it will be makabel tuma. But however, we're saying it's only considered a chibur b'shas malacha when it's being used. But when it's not being used, even if though it's still attached, albeit temporarily, but it's not considered a chibur. So what's the difference between this and the previous case? He answered, he says the difference is because when it's not being used, when you're not chopping with it, it's not being used, then the handle is now oimed to be separated and thrown back into the wood pile. So he is only keeping it there temporarily and has no intention to keep it there and use it for anything further. But over here, even though he's not laundering it, he's finished laundering it, but he still wants to keep it attached together, and he still has some potential use for it. But he wants it to be stitched together, because if it does get dirty, now he can launder it again, and he doesn't have to stitch it back together. So over here, even though he's finished cleaning it, he's finished doing the laundry with it, but perhaps it might get dirty again and he might have to launder it again. So he still wants it to be attached together. By the case of the handle, it's going to be discarded. He has no use for it to be attached together. They taught in the name of Hofstedter, and some say in the name of Rav. Who's the Tana that says whatever is attached to it? Legabe Tuma is considered kamayu, it's considered one item, and therefore if Tuma comes into contact with one, it's matama the rest of it. Amar Vihuda, Amar Rav, Ramer, it's Ramer. And we learned in the following Mishnah, Beis Hapach, or Beis Hatavlon, or Beis Haner Shebekira. The kira is a stove. Sometimes they used to attach to the side of the stove a separate container to warm up, let's say, oil or spices, or to light a candle. Now, this was not permanently attached to the kira, did not serve the same function as the kira. The kira was used as a stove to cook items, put pots inside, and this was an ancillary use to warm up oil or light a candle, but it was attached to the kira. So it's similar to the cases we were just discussing, that they're separate items, but they're attached. They're attached on a temporary basis. Metamim b'maga vein metamim ba'aver divramer. He says if tuma comes into the kira and touches the walls of the floor of the kira, then this ancillary kli, the small kli that's attached to it, is also tome. Now, a kira is a kli cheres. A kli cheres is mekabel tuma only from the interior, not from the exterior, not from the outside. Secondly, it also is mekabel tuma from the interior, even if it doesn't touch any part of it, just from the airspace. Now, on a derisidic level, if a tuma, let's say a dead sheretz, falls into the airspace of the stove of the kira, then it's tome, and all parts of it would be tome. So midaraisa, there's no difference if it falls into the airspace or if it lands on the floor or it touches the walls. There's no difference. Once it's in the interior of the kira, the entire kira will become tome. Now here we're making a distinction. We're saying over here that if the tuma falls in and it touches the kira from the inside, then it becomes tome. Then these ancillary items become tome. But if it doesn't touch, if it only comes into the airspace of the interior of the kira, these ancillary kalim do not become tome. That's what Rav Meir says. Rav Shimon Matayim. And Rav Shimon says, in any event, it's Torah. So now, Bishlam, Rav Shimon, we can understand the sheet of Rav Shimon. Why does it say it's Torah? Because Savra la kikira dami. He holds that these ancillary kalim are not part of the kira. It's not a chibur. So the kira becomes tame, but these don't. It's not one and the same. It's not part and parcel of the kira. They happen to be attached to the side of it, but it's not the kira itself. Elul Rav Meir, but according to Rav Meir, what's the hesber? Ike kira dame, if you consider it to be a kira, afil baver namelitma. Then, just like the kira itself is tame from the interior airspace, then they should also become tame if the tuma is in the interior airspace of the kira. And ilavke kira dame, if you don't consider part of the kira, afil b'maga nami loy litma, and if it's not part of the kira, then even if it touches the interior, it also shouldn't be tame. Midaraisa, there's no chilek, there's no difference if the tuma is in the interior of the kli cheres, whether it's in the air or touching, it makes no difference. The more answers, loylam lavki kira dome. Really, it's not. Midaraisa, it's not part of the kira. The Rabbanan made a gzeira. They were geyser that even though midaraisa, it's not a chibur, it's not one and the same, they were geyser, since it has an appearance of being mechuber, they were geyser that the ancillary kalim should become tome as well. Well, if they're geyser, then you should say, even if it came into the airspace, not only touched the interior, it should become tome, even in the interior airspace, it should become tome. More answers of the Rabbanan Hekera ki hechdu also misra of Truma v'kodshim. The Rabbanan made a heker. They wanted to demonstrate that this is midrabanan. It's not midaraisa. So they had to differentiate between this chibur and a case where it's mechuber midaraisa. Now, something which is mechuber daraisa, therefore it would be tome vadai. Now, even though normally it's also to burn truma and kachim, but when it becomes tome, you're mechuyev to burn it. You have to burn it. Now, people might think, well, if there's tuma, then let's say on this ancillary keli, on this pach of shemen, if it was shemen of truma, if the sheretz came into the interior of the kira, and we said that the oil is tome, they might think it's tome midaraisa and burn it. So the Rabbanan made a heker to differentiate, to show that this is not tuma daraisa. They said, and differentiated between a case where there is a chibur daraisa. They said that only if it touches the interior of the kira is the shemen in the pach, is it tame. But if it only in the airspace, it's not. Therefore, it will be clear to people that this tuma that we're dealing with over here is a tuma derabbanan, not a tuma deraisa, because midaraisa there's no such chiluk. And therefore, they were geyser that this type of a chibur, that they were machmir that it should be treated like a chibur, and therefore the shemen in the pach will also become tome midirabanan. So, but they made a heker that it's only if it touches the interior of the kira, not if it comes in the airspace of the kira. So, as Taisus, therefore, as we mentioned before, that by the shalal shel kaisim, it's also midirabanan. So, this is the shita of Rab Meir, that this type of a chibur is midirabanan considered a chibur, and similarly in the chain of the launderers, they stitched it together on a temporary basis, it's a chibur midirabanan. So if a sheretz touches one item of the clothing, they all become tamei midirabanan. Where is the heker over there? Well, we're saying over here that if it's a tumah d'Rabbanan, the Rabbanan made a heker to differentiate between this and a tumah d'oraisa. Where is the heker over there? Zaktaisis, the heker is because it's only a chibur l'tumah. But for hazah, as we mentioned, if one is matayar, one of the clothing, if it came into contact with a mess, with tumas mess, and he's matayar one of the garments through hazah, that hazah is not effective for the rest of them. Midoraisa, if it would have been a chibur d'oraisa, it would have been. But this is a heker to show you it's only a chibur d'Rabbanan, and therefore it's not effective. By kira, this type of heker is not relevant because a kli cheres, there's no tara for it. It has to be broken. So that is not a heker. That's not effective for the case of the kira. They have made the different type of chiluk. They're machalik in a different way, whether it comes into the interior airspace or it touches the interior of the kira. If you have scissors, that the blade is taken in and out, or the blade of a plane, they put the blade in the plane when it's used to smoothen out the boards, and then they take the blade off. So it's similar to the case we're talking. It's temporarily attached, but it's not permanently attached. It's considered a chibur for tumah, so therefore if tumah touches the blade, the rest of it will become tomei. Or in the case of, if it's a metal item, if it touches the scissors, then the blade will become tomei. Similar type of on what we just discussed. So, if you consider this to be a genuine chibur, that it's attached, then it's one and the same. Well, if it's considered one and the same, it's part and parcel of the same kli, afilozon nami. Even for azah, we should say, if you're maza, you sprinkle the water of the paraduma on one component, the entire scissors or plane should become torn. And if it's not a chibur, if it's not considered one kli, then the tumah touching one component should not be matama the other component. Like we mentioned before, at the time it's being used, chibur ben latuma ben lahazah. It's considered a tumah ben chibur, whether tumah hazah is considered one. But when it's not being used, when it's not being used, it's not considered a chibur, not for tumah, not for hazah. But when it's not being used, there's a gzeira, drabonon shaloi b'shas malacha mishum tuma sheb'shas malacha. Val hazah sheb'shas malacha mishum hazah shaloi b'shas malacha. But they were machmer in both cases. Now, b'shas malacha, it's a genuine chibur. So, but they were geyser on tumah shaloi b'shas malacha if when it's not being used. If you would say that tumah that comes into contact with one part of it is not matama the other part of it, people might think and say it's not considered one. And even when it's being used, it's not considered one. And therefore, they'll say even b'shas malacha, if the tumah came into contact with one part, with one component, the other is not tumah. Therefore, they were geyser the tumah even shaloi b'shas malacha. And similarly, azom b'shas malacha, they were machmir and said even at the time b'shas malacha, when it's being used, if you sprinkle the waters of the mechatas on one component, really midaraisa it should be matar the other component. But we're afraid that if that's the case, people will say even when it's not being used, even when it's not being used, that also Hazo on one component should be matar the other component, and that's not so because Shaloi B'Shas Malacha, it's not a chibur. So therefore, Hazo B'Shas Malacha, Mishum Hazo, Shaloi B'Shas Malacha, they were going around Hazo B'Shas Malacha, they were machmir that it should not be Hazo, Mishum Shaloi B'Shas Malacha. Now, additional point that has to be addressed is that what comes out from here that when we say B'Shas Malacha, that it's a chibur, we're saying midoraisa, when it's being used, b'shas malacha, is midoraisa considered one kli. And it's a chibur midoraisa. And tuma on one component will be mitama the other component. So that would seem to mean that when it's being used, it should be a chibur doraisa. Now, but the shalal shel kaisim, we said, Taisus mentioned that midoraisa, even when it's being used, the launderers, the kaisim, are laundering it. Even b'shas malach, it's the rabbanan. It's a chibur rabbanan, not the raisa. And Taisus mentioned that therefore hazo on one garment will not be matar the other garments, even when it's stitched together, even when it's b'shas malacha. So if Taisus the kasha, well, why do we say over here by the scissors on the plane? Why do we say b'shas malacha? It's a chibur doraisa. Why shouldn't we say the same thing by the shalal shel kaisim? So the teretz is that over here by the blade, they are not independent of each other. You cannot use the scissors without the blade. You can't use the plane without the blade. So they're meant to function together. So b'shas together, when they are attached, even though it's only on a temporary basis, but this is the way it's being used. And this is the only way it can be used. It's considered, therefore, one kli. The shalal shel kaisim, they're separate garments. They're separate independent garments. It's just for convenience that they are being laundered together. But we can't consider this to be one kli because they function independently of each other. They're separate kalim. It's just for convenience, he's laundering it together. Even b'shas malach over there, you cannot consider it as one. Mashen kain over here, this is the way it can be used. They cannot be used independently. So b'shas malacha, when they are attached and they are being used, here we view it as one because it truly is one kli. That's the way it's being used and it's the way it's meant to be used.